Today, I have the distinct pleasure of hosting Rohit Kumar on my podcast. Rohit has been in the social impact space for more than a decade and a half and is the co founder of Young Leaders for Active Citizenship, YLAC, where they work towards increasing participation of young people in policy-making process, and the Quantum Hub, a firm which works on research, advocacy, and communication while working on complex public policy problems. Rohit has an illustrious educational background with a degree in engineering from IIT Bombay and a master's in public administration from Harvard University. I've wanted to host you on my podcast for a while now, Rohit, and I'm so glad you're here today. And we are talking about your work and journey today. So, Rohit, while I've given a brief introduction of sorts about your career journey and work, why don't you tell us more about the same and what's life been like for you growing up and coming into this sector, and what's the work like at the Quantum Hub and YLAC?
First, thank you for having me, Ayush. I have heard a few episodes that you've done previously, and I was also hoping to be on the podcast. So I'm glad that you're here. In terms of my background, I think there are different and many different parts to the story, which have kind of come together. So I'll try and sort of give you an overview. I was born into a middle class family in Chandigarh, raised by a single mother because my parents divorced when I was very young. And then, obviously that kind of came with its own challenges, etc. For instance, and I think that has also shaped a lot of what I ended up experimenting and becoming. So me and my mom are very, very close, and she raised me, being raised in a single parent sort of household in a middle class setup always meant that your career choices were somewhat predetermined in some way. That for instance, humanities was never on the agenda. My mom herself is a biology. She dropped out of her PhD when she got married, and so she's always been a sciences person. So I was also exposed, and because of economic opportunities, pushed into the direction of sciences. So I ended up studying for engineering, ended up getting into IIT, and that was like a very, very fantastic moment for me and my mom both. And at IIT is where I sort of got wings, and I think this happens with most IITians, that you're really slogging in the run up to IIT. And once you're in, then you start experimenting. And, so IIT in some ways gives you wings. So there isn't when, in addition to a lot of academic work that we did, and I was exposed to really bright folks, I also started experimenting with what I wanted to do and what I wanted to be. And that started with student body politics in some ways. So contesting elections at the hostel level, graduating to contesting elections at the institute level, where I was the student body academic affairs general secretary, and I used to sit in the institute senate. And those were in some ways the beginnings of sort of policy impact exposure that I started to have. I also became very involved in the group of rural activities, and that is where it started. But I think some of these thoughts were still getting formulated. So while I was graduating from IIT, I was aiming for the top placement jobs. So I got into BCT, which was day one. And that was a fantastic experience, but it was management consulting, right? So 2 years I was there, but I think the bug had already bitten me. And from there on, I decided to experiment and explore and went to PRS. And the way that happened also is that at that time, and the reason I'm saying this in some detail is because it feeds into the part of the story that I'm going to tell you later, is that at that time there were no structured channels into policy and impact. This is 2007, and the space is just starting to grow. And so what that meant is that when I was looking for opportunities, I didn't have too many. So I spoke to a lot of different people, got all kinds of advice from drop everything and hit the ground, etc., etc. And one thing led to another, and I ended up at PRS. And that is when my real sort of policy journey started. But let me just stop there. And
Lovely. That's great. And anytime and every time someone mentions Chandigarh in the 90s, I'm reminded of the Jaspal Bhatti show. If you've seen any of the flop show, thing. So that's the old world charm of Chandigarh is just absolutely amazing. One of the things that every policy professional at one time or other considers a civil services exam.
Yeah.
So did you ever consider that as well?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, once I started with PRS, I don't know if you would call it foolish, decided to prepare for the civils in parallel while working at PRS. So I was at PRS for 3 years, and PRS was just absolutely fantastic. I think I made my way in by telling Madhukar and Madhavan that, I'm also an engineer. I understand how to do coding. I'm going to build some systems for you, which I did. Like, the PRS MP track I built,
Oh,
and it
wow.
still runs after so many years because I learned how to make access databases and do all of that. But then I used that to nudge my way in to get me to work on legislation. So Aadhaar was actually the first legislation that I worked on. So it did
Yeah.
give me a lot of exposure. But as I was sort of doing this, I also felt that the real power, at least in the Indian policy ecosystem, lies with either the politicians or the bureaucrats, and
Yeah.
the others are supporting infrastructure. And that is where I was coming from, and that is the reason why I thought that I should give it a shot, and that would be a great way to contribute. So I did prepare for the civils while at PRS. I think a lot of the other colleagues or friends that I had at that time were leaving everything and doing it.
Yeah.
So I used to study on the way to PRS. I used to study on the way back from PRS on the bus that I used to take, and I used to study on weekends and do coaching and all of that. And I did that for 2 years. So I gave two attempts. In the first one, I had reached the mains, but whatever, the rank didn't happen. And the second one, I got through the interviews and I got a rank, and I was, I think, in the reserve list. But then I decided not to sort of take it forward.
And when you've spent a lot of time in legislative research and after PRS as well, which was like a 2 or 3 year stint, you worked with Mr. Jay Panda's office. And it's after that, probably I can say that the chunk of your time before founding YLAC and TQH went in legislative research. What were your takeaways?
I think, firstly, Mr. Panda. So when I decided not to take up civils again, because that's a very unpredictable exam, and I think people tend to put their life on hold
Yeah.
trying to sort of get in, and I think it doesn't do justice to students who are well-meaning and wanting to put in effort. So, anyways, because it is so unpredictable, I consulted a lot of people and I decided that's not the way to go. And I think that was also the beginning of the realization that the world is bigger than just the political and the bureaucratic offices. And ultimately, what I initially called or thought of as the supporting infrastructure also has a very huge role to play in shaping the agenda from the outside, perhaps, but in really defining the contours of how policy gets made. And so I thought that maybe I should understand how the rest of the system also works. And at that time, Mr. Panda, and because I had built the MP track, I used to see that Mr. Panda was a very high performing MP in the MP track. So I reached out to him and he interviewed me. He liked this thing, and I said, okay, let's do that. So I joined the office. I think it was the first. I got a very good overview of how obviously Parliament works, which I had to a large extent in PRS as well, but also how policy interacts with politics. Right, and also the limitations of what MPs who are not in power face, right? So basically, how much power do they have, what they can or cannot do. What was good about Mr. Panda is that he was willing to experiment, and he gave us a free hand. And during that time, we built up his office. We wrote a lot of private member bills. We used that for advocacy. We did stuff on freedom of speech. We did stuff on strengthening Comptroller Auditor General, because at that time the CAG scam, the 2G scam had happened. Then we did a lot of work. We did stuff on sedition. We did stuff on tobacco. We wrote lots of opinion pieces. We pushed him to start writing in Hindi. And we started doing policy workshops with young people, because one of my learnings also was that, people somehow just have a very cynical worldview of politics and policy, and that is partly born out of ignorance about how the system runs, and a lack of appreciation of constraints in which politicians also operate. And I think Mr. Panda was very open to that idea. So I think what really happened in that office is that I was able to exercise a lot of leadership. So I think that those were my first experiments with leadership, and also experimentation generally in policy. And really, and I also got to see how civil society does lobbying, or how does civil society do advocacy, if because lobbying people associate with all kinds of things, but it's the same thing, how civil society advocates for things they care about with parliamentarians. And I think that experience was a genesis of both YLAC and TQH in some ways, in terms of how it sort of shaped up.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And another thing that uh, most Indian populace looks at its politicians in a certain manner. And I think when you work with a politician, like a legislative research assistant, or a lot of demystification happens of the world of politics. So how did you look at, and especially if you had to compare that to before getting into PRS and getting into these circles of working with politicians, growing up as a kid who wants to go to IIT in Chandigarh, how do you reflect back on that
So
journey?
a lot had changed because my perception initially was also conditioned by the perception of my parents and everybody around
Yeah.
me. In fact, the funny thing is that when I first told my mom that I want to leave BCG and move to PRS, this happened. So I had already taken up the job. I had I informed her later because I was obviously anticipating resistance. And I distinctly remember the scene. I was out for a run on Marine Drive, and I used to run because my house was near there in Bombay. And I called up my mom and I told her I've taken this job, and I while BCG is nice and all, this is not where my heart is. And she kind of also threw a fit. And there was so much shouting that happened on the road on the phone because she was like, "You're going to throw away everything, and take a substantial salary cut," because it became 1/4, and work with politicians who
I can literally
yeah.
picture you
How will I
standing
even
at
tell
Marine
people that you're
Drive
working with politicians,
being
right?
yelled at.
And but of course, I had already spoken to a couple of people. And initially, because I was joining a civil society organization, I was not directly joining a politician. So I think there was a little bit of that. Plus, I wanted to have a little bit more faith in the system.
Yeah.
And I think because I myself did some student politics on campus, that really had already started to change my perspective. And that is also the reason why I am, among many other people, a big advocate for having these kinds of student political systems in colleges, because it's a contained exposure that you're not going to get in the real world directly, because the real world is far more convoluted, right? So, for instance, in IIT, when you would go and contest an election, you are going door to door campaigning, you're knocking on hostel doors, you're being interrogated, you are being interrogated by the student paper. It's not like the DU politics, it's way cleaner because there is no political party interference, but that sort of sets the stage, right? So I was coming from there, a perspective of already started changing. But when I came in, and when I came into Mr. Panda's office also, actually before that with PRS, because PRS had already exposed us. I still remember my first meeting with an MP when Madhavan, who was my boss, we were going for a briefing. It was late in the evening. We went to this row house in central Delhi, one of those bungalows. And he literally just walked into the door. There was no security, there was nothing. And then we knocked on the door, and the MP opened the door, and he was in a lungi, because it was his house. And I was, and the MP sat next to us on the sofa, and I was doing Madhavan and I were doing the briefing. And I noticed that, this is a very normal person. There did not seem to be such, if I say, shusha around that, person. And I felt that, we need to see people for who they are, and everybody is operating in a larger context, right? And then subsequently, I had many more MP meetings. In fact, the second MP meeting, which was very memorable for me, is that I had done a brief on petroleum pricing. And at that time, Sushma Swaraj was going to open the debate on parliament. And I went and briefed her, and I always used to admire her for her oratory. And she used a lot of what I said or what I had written in parliament while she was taking on the government. And I told my mom, and I said, I was sitting next to Sushma Swaraj, and I was so excited. And then I think dheere dheere, because of all of this, the person behind that position started becoming more real. And obviously, everybody has, everybody is not good. That's fine. Everybody has different facets to their personality. Some people can obviously be, but that's also true for any other sector. Right. So I think that started breaking for me. And I also started realizing the vulnerabilities that people themselves have and stuff like that. And when you work closely with an MP also, and you're you're the head of their team, you're having discussions, so you understand, kya pressures hain, kya constraints hain. It kind of humanizes the person. And so, I think it changed over a period of time. That's what it did for me.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the quickest ways these days considered is to intern with a member of parliament or work with a member of parliament, because there's so many. and they're so underserved in terms of research support. But what would your advice be to those people who are looking at considering working with a member of parliament? One, how should they go about that? And second, what should they expect from that particular internship or work experience?
See, I think it's a great experience. And to be honest, in internships, you don't really lose anything. That is anyways the opportunity to experiment. I think, but just if you want to make the best out of any of that kind of internship, the first thing is that most MPs, as you said, don't have big resources in their teams. So by virtue of being under resourced, it also means that they are, perhaps it can be a little disorganized or may not have oversight.
Yeah.
And the MP is obviously not going to have so much time to sit with you. So it will really depend on how much initiative can you take, how much leadership can you demonstrate, and what if you go in assuming that somebody is going to completely guide you, that's not going to happen. So I think that's how I would sort of make the best of it. And in terms of how you get these, I think a lot of MPs are open to some of these things. And YLAC, for instance, runs the Policy Square as a forum. There are a lot of opportunities that keep coming our way. It is obviously competitive, but I think if you really want to do something like this, it shouldn't be that hard to find.
Right. Now that you have mentioned YLAC, and I was anyway going to suggest one of the best ways to get an exposure to the policy space and maybe even work for an MP on research briefs, I think YLAC.
And that is what we were trying to do when we sort of
Yeah.
wanted to set that up.
So 8 years of having this baby. How do you now look at it?
It is and has been a baby, yes. In fact, something that we always joke about is that a startup is like a kid. You are putting in as much blood, sweat, and everything into it as you would perhaps put into a kid. No, I think it's been a fantastic journey. What started with an idea has ballooned into a very large, different sort of a form that actually, to be honest, we hadn't completely envisaged earlier. I always think that sometimes when founders say that I have this vision, mission, I feel what bull crap.
How did it start? Like, what was the genesis?
Yeah.
What was day zero thinking like?
No, the day zero was like this only. I mean, Prajita and I had met when I was at PRS. My co-founder Prajita, who's also my wife, and I'll come to that later. She at that time was in the first cohort of LAMP, and that is how we met. The funny thing is that I was the training staff, and because I was on the part of the core PRS team, and she was a part of the LAMP cohort. We had both recognized that we have good work ethic, and I think that's where it kind of started. But both of us had a similar, not somewhat similar, somewhat dissimilar journey into this space, and that is of experimentation and discovery of people who cared about the country, policy, politics, or the socio-economic setup, but were coming from non-conventional families. Actually, I wouldn't call them non-conventional. Perhaps conventional families that did not have exposure to politics or policy previously, right? So we were all trying to find our ways in, but we were passionate in a different way, and there weren't enough structured mechanisms to get exposure, and we did a hit and trial to find our way in. And the genesis of YLAC was essentially in the fact that what we felt is that there are many more people like us, right, who are perhaps passionate, talented, privileged, want to do something, but perhaps before they figure out a way to do anything, the system and the public narrative disillusionment gets to you and you disengage, right? So the idea was that can we create platforms or forums where people get exposure, where one, their cynicism is broken, they get some exposure, and then that becomes a starting point for whatever journey that you want to take. And that's how YLAC started.
Yeah, and what it's been like. Tell us a little more about the work that YLAC does today and the kind of milestones it has been able to hit in that work.
Yeah, so we started in 2016. I was just coming back from Harvard, and actually the first program was going to start 6 days after I landed.
Wow.
And so I had initially Prajata had registered the organization as an individual proprietor in her name because I was in the US. I was making the website sitting in the Harvard lab and going it live while having discussions with my colleague who said that, are you sure you want to work with your wife? It may not be a good decision. But it started with that, and we started with the idea that we want to hit at the age group 13 to 30. And the idea was to pick high school students also, because there is usually less focus on that age group, but that is the age when your ideas are being formulated. And obviously look at university students and young professionals, because you're already starting to think about some of these things and taking them into your life. Specific focus was the urban privileged, and it has continued to be so. The theory of change basically there being that while there are a lot of civil society organizations that do work with the marginalized, and that needs to be done because you need to strengthen those ecosystems, privileged have a lot of power and position in society, and they can be very strong advocates for change. And in fact, history of social movements across the world show that movements that really work, be it the independence movement, be it the gender rights movement, or be it anything else, usually have privileged folks as strong allies because they come with network, social capital, a voice, and therefore it is important to create setups where they get co-opted. But the way they'll get co-opted and not disengage, and it is the easiest for privilege to disengage because they don't depend on government and policy as much, right? They can lead their private lives, they can go to private schools, they can fly, they can do all of that. So there is a need to build sensitization among them, build them awareness, and break the cynicism, and then show what a potential path could look like. And so that is the group that we were targeting. So we were targeting urban privileged 13 to 30. We decided to start with a high school program. And that was a city-wide high school program that we ran in Delhi in a place called Zorba on the Mehrauli Gurgaon Road, where we curated and selected about 33 odd young people. When we first launched, I wasn't even sure who would sign up because, this is active citizenship. Why would a young person want to spend their summer doing this? And that is the reason why we wanted to make it fun also, while introspective. So that is the program we started with. It started with ideas of identity privilege, justice, how does the government work, how do you contribute? From there on, so that program really, when we tested it out and the kind of feedback we got from the parents and students after that program ended was really, initially we just started it with that as an idea. Let's do this and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But when we ran it and we got that feedback, we were like, maybe we are onto something. And that led us to then experimenting on other things. So the second program we did was a policy in action program, which was targeting young professionals and students. Then we expanded into doing more fellowships. We started Artivist, which is an art fellowship that, people who are creative, how do you get them to use their creativity for advocacy? Then we moved on to equality, where we partnered with Oxfam to do school-based interventions. So it moved from fellowships to school-based interventions, to partnerships with local government on urban redesign, to mobility fellowships, to school-based curriculum redesign, and stuff like that. So it's been a very wide array of experimentation and this thing, but singularly they're all connected with the idea that I'm trying to build awareness and find those people who have a spark.
That's very interesting, and I think very much needed. If we were to take from your own journey, I think if you had done a high school achievers program sitting in Chandigarh, maybe you would have taken some internships and been thinking about it sooner. And that's what's happening with so many of the beneficiaries of YLAC.
And what YLAC is trying to do for students, to be honest, I do want to give credit. PRS has done for many of us.
Yeah.
Right. But the only difference is that PRS is catching me when I've already made up my mind.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm trying to be a wider end of the funnel before PRS.
Yeah.
In some way.
Fair enough. And you have now people who were the beneficiary of the program in high school actually working with you after having done their LAM fellowship and coming into the program.
Yeah, so this is the first year we ended up hiring somebody who actually got into our network, I think in grade 9th or 10th in Calcutta, in what was then called the Counter Speech Fellowship, which was the art-based fellowship. Yeah. And they graduated, learned through us about policy, and then LAMP and PRS, did another fellowship with us, went into LAMP, and we finally hired them. So it's been a long gestation.
Yeah, and I think one of the distinguishing features of a lot of things which achieve success is the patience part of it, as founders to have
Absolutely,
that kind
absolutely.
of patience. But other than patience, this, like anyway, I believe doing something of your own with the kind of tricky revenue models there are in the social impact space is a very difficult thing. What do you think, where so many have perished, you were successful? What were the reasons for that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a very valid point that you mentioned. The funding ecosystem is very tricky. I think two things that helped us. One is the fact that because of the kind of audience that we were working with, we also decided to design it as a social enterprise, which meant that it could generate its own revenues. It was not modeled as a not for profit, though now there are discussions on sort of changing that model because
Yeah.
there are constraints on the social enterprise side as well. But the other reason why we registered is that the social enterprise is because when you're working on active citizenship, it can be tricky, because government pressure, and you can perhaps end up saying the wrong thing or whatever. But because we were social enterprise, we were one part of our revenue was coming from our students, etc., on our own, and we were using it also to cross subsidize and do scholarships, etc. Eventually that model ended up changing a little bit, where we were working with partners who were paying us to run things. For instance, Instagram paid, funded the counter speech fellowship for 6 years, where it is free for students but it was being paid for by Instagram. Similarly, Oxfam was paying us for running the equality clubs. But there have been, in the last 1 or 2 years, there have been more challenges on this front because of the whole ecosystem around funding in India, cancellation of FCRAs and stuff like that. But I think the other thing that helped us is because we also run TQH, which is a public policy consulting firm, and that is modeled like a consulting for-profit firm. It it was an alternative source of revenue that allows us to also mitigate the ups and downs that may come with running anything, and helps us have a little bit more resilience than perhaps others can do.
I would love to also discuss in more detail your other baby in the Quantum Hub.
Yeah.
What's been the journey like for Quantum Hub?
So the journey for TQH and the Quantum Hub basically has been that it was started a year after YLAC,
Yes.
and it had its genesis in what we had seen in our work. So before we started YLAC and TQH, Aprajita was in Snapdeal, and she was as a part of their policy team. So she used to interface a lot with government, etc. at the time, and at that time the e-commerce sector was booming, and a lot of startups had raised money. And one of the things we had realized at that time is that she realized also is that the new lot of entrepreneurs who are coming in with the economy opening up in this whole startup ecosystem, they don't have prior connections with government or a network to navigate this space and or an understanding, unlike say a Tata or a Reliance or somebody else who have had history of family and this thing, and they're deeply embedded, so they know how policy works, which means that there is a growing need for professional support. I had realized a little bit of this from the social sector side also, because in Mr. Panda's office, we used to, as I was saying initially, we used to get a lot of civil society groups come and tell us, "Ki, sir, can you help raise this issue? Can you help, put forward this legislation? Can you do this?" And we used to see that advocacy happening through MPs. And I also, while talking to many of the civil society groups, I used to feel that especially academics, grassroots organizations, researchers, always, while they're very solid about their subject, they don't know how policy making works as well. They don't know how influence needs to be built, how media needs to be navigated, and therefore there is a need for professional support. And conventionally, the kind of entities that existed in the space were largely either PR firms or law firms, and so either they will really understand comms but they may not be as solid academically or on the research piece, or there'll be lawyers who'll have a very legal lens to it, or there'll be researchers who don't understand how comms and advocacy work. And so because we had Aprajita was already coming from this, we were talking to somebody. There was a USAID project that was coming out at that time. We said, we have experience, can we experiment and start? And then that's how it literally started, with one project. And because we were also policy professionals, we were also keen that in addition to the work that I am doing in education through YLAC, I need to also be an active policy professional, and actually then I can bring more learnings also, right? Like, this is the US academic system where you have people, faculty who are very involved in policy making, etc., but are also teaching. So, we thought that why don't we build that kind of an institution where both happen? That I'm at the cutting edge of research and advocacy, but I'm also able to translate into what I teach people, and how do I sort of bring it together. So that is how it started. It started with one project, then it grew to two, and then I think word of mouth started spreading that here are these young people who solid in what they do. And then one thing led to another, led to another, led to another, and 7 years later, we are one of the biggest in the space, consulting space, and we are also one of the only ones, I think, that are very multi-sectoral and do a lot of social policy work, which conventionally people would either not do as much because they thought it wouldn't pay, or stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think that's what also distinguishes you, because traditionally there have been some quote unquote lobbyist firms that have, but when someone looks at the Quantum Hub, they don't see them as a lobbyist. They see them as a research organization which helps with public policy and regulatory policies, but also does a variety of work. I think that's, yeah.
And I think we very consciously tried to do that, in the sense that position it as a hybrid of a think tank and a consulting. To be honest, I don't know what will be the dynamics of the space and how it will evolve. For instance, we are very particular that if we are writing an op-ed, it is our opinion. I'm not writing it on behalf of anyone. It's my opinion, and it's a considered opinion. So I think we're also trying to sort of play that carefully and distinguish ourselves from others around us, and also distinguish ourselves by looking at the breadth of work, because ultimately there is a very solid belief that both Aprajita and I have. We are generalists starting to specialize now. Obviously as you grow older, you can't just be generalists, but we do believe in the interconnection of things, right? And we do believe that everything is layered, right? Policy is also intersectional. For instance, when I am looking at tech policy, I'm not just looking at technology, because technology is a layer on society, right? And so technology may exacerbate certain things that you're seeing around you, or may remove certain hurdles. So for instance, the fact that you're talking about social media, it can exacerbate social tensions. There's a gender dynamic to it. So if I only understand the tech, but I don't understand the sociology or the gender dynamic, then I only have a part of the lens, right? So therefore, for us, building a multi-sectoral firm also means that I cross-pollinate ideas from, for instance, as an example, last year we did a report with Zoom on the gender implications of hybrid work. Now, some people have been speaking about it, but there isn't enough, because there is a need, and we do a lot of work on gender policy. So we know that one of the biggest reasons for drop-offs from the labor force is the fact that women take off time for care work. But if maybe tech can be a solution to some of the flexibility that is needed, you can retain women in the workforce, right? So there are these layers in any policy.
And 7 years of doing that and being sort of the uncrowned king and queen in this space.
You're being kind.
What have been the challenges doing this?
I think the challenges, to be honest, keep changing every day, and I think it's the story of every entrepreneur. I think our family keeps joking that you guys have been in startup mode like 8 saal ho gaye. You've been in startup mode continuously. Every time they call us, we are like busy because we don't have as much time. Because the nature of the problem and the size of the problem or the facet of the problem changes. But the challenge, like initially the challenge was that how do you build a brand and compete against folks who have an established practice, right? Like, so there are people who've been doing this for a while. They already have networks and connections. Here are these 30-year-olds, 35-year-olds who are starting to do it. Yes, of course, they have legacy and, they have some of the brands behind them. But why will they be able to do this? Why should I experiment with them? And I think one of the biggest challenges in service industry is that it's not like a manufacturing plant where you set it up and then you switch off. I think quality assurance in service industry is very, one of the things I've heard from multiple clients is that usually what happens is that the founders will pitch the project and it all seems hunky-dory. And then the founders will slowly start giving less and less time, and then the quality will start falling apart. So that has been a very big challenge for us. And I think, if I say so myself, I've heard from, and I'm quoting verbatim from a client who basically said that I think this is what distinguishes you, that I see that somehow you've managed to build these systems wherein, one, you have oversight, yes, but the system doesn't fall apart when you're not there. And I think that is the biggest challenge in service industry, where you are also dealing with the smartest people on both sides. So you have smart people in your team, how do you keep them motivated? And you have smart people and demanding people on the client side. So how do you build that brand? So I think initially the battle ended up meaning that we had to really push ourselves to make sure that we do quality checks in a way that it sets a culture where bad quality is not okay, and I will not send anything which is bad quality. And then how do you sort of imbibe it in the organization that tomorrow, when you can't oversee everything because too much is happening, and it has started to happen, then the system doesn't fall apart, right? So I think that's been for TQH.
Fair, fair enough. Fair enough. I think one of the themes of our conversation until now has been money, and money like is a sensitive subject when it comes to the public policy and social impact space. You mentioned that you took a pay cut of 75% to be able to work for 3 years at PRS. And similarly, you did go and do a degree in US, and post that you had the courage to start something of your own when so many things are unstable and you're thinking of the return on investment.
Yeah.
Let's talk about generally what has been your relationship with money.
See, in terms of my relationship with money, I think, as I said, one, growing up, because my mother was single, we were under a lot of financial stress. And, my father, for whatever reason, had decided not to pay any alimony. So it was pretty much my mom. But, I think what helped is that we were living at my grandparents' house, though my grandparents were no more. But, that takes away the pressure of having to pay up for a house. So I think that was there. But I think the way I was raised, always money was important to have, but it was perhaps not the be all and end all of everything, because I think there was a realization that there is a marginal utility to everything, right? Like, if you have a certain amount of money, you can have a good life. Beyond it, you can buy more expensive things, but how much does it add to your quality of life? That's perhaps, it's not guaranteed. Somehow, I think I never really had that huge charm for earning a lot of money. When I first joined BCG from IIT, I was one of the highest paid out of this thing. But there also, money was just a validation for the fact that I was good. It wasn't money per se that was driving my decision. It was the fact that, that you had to prove to the world that you are good, and the world somehow puts puts a monetary value that you're being good, and that's how it validates it, right? So that is where it was coming from. But I was never really somebody who really was interested in a lot of these things, but I wanted a good life. And I think so that's why, in fact, that is a conversation I had with somebody when I was leaving BCG to move to PRS. And I remember I used to work out of the Bombay office. I was visiting Delhi, and I had already put in my resignation, and I was sitting among colleagues, and there was a principal in the team who is basically the second or the third tier in BCG, who came and asked me that, I heard that, I saw your resignation email, and I heard that you're moving to this very interesting place called PRS. I'm presuming you would be taking a very massive pay cut. How are you going to manage? Have you thought about it? And I told him, how much my salary is going to be, and he was very shocked. He was like, but how will you handle? I said, to be honest, what do I need it for? And sometimes in consulting, I used to see people, a lot of us used to get a high from going and having very expensive dinners that you build to the company and stuff like that. It never really gave me that kind of high. So I was telling him that I don't think it'll really matter. And to be honest, in the years that I was working at PRS, and because anyways I was studying for IAS, I really didn't have time to spend any money. It didn't bother me at all, and it was fine. And then when I went to the US, I actually ended up going on full scholarship and ended up saving money, because I was I was a TA, I was teaching. So I actually ended up saving money and earning more and sort of bringing it back. But money, having reasonable amount to be comfortable has been an agenda, but having a lot more has never been an agenda. And I do feel that if you are good at what you do, money will find you eventually, even if not initially. And I don't think that should be necessarily the goal. The goal should be being good at what you are, and money, I do believe, will find you.
I think that's That's a thought that a lot of people in the social sector. But I think the other thing, that the validation part is, I think a lot of social sector professionals are kind of struggling with. And I would say there are multiple categories within the social impact space, and I would still say that a TQH and these spaces still pay decently enough. But when it's about having some money and maybe earning much more later, that's okay. But when it's about how your parents, how your peers, let's say your IIT Bombay peers, if they had to look at your salaries today, if let's say you were not running your own startup but doing like a job at PRS, and the way they would have looked at that salary can be a little disheartening sometimes. And I think that's what I usually gather when it's the societal gauge, it's the societal pressure. What's your perspective on that?
No, and you're absolutely right. And I perhaps, in light of what you said, I do want to couch that money will find you in areas where you can earn money. If you're choosing to work in places, for instance, you're an activist, then money may not find you. And but I think all of us, then it's about a conscious decision that what is it that gives you more satisfaction? Is it money, or is it that impact
Yeah.
that you're trying to create? And I think each of us have to answer that questions for ourselves. And I do understand the pressure and everything, but I think once you answer that question for yourself, and if you are confident in terms of what you're doing, the others will slowly align. And otherwise you probably need to disengage with folks who still measure you in terms of money. So as an example, a lot of friends and everybody, so when I obviously moved, and people continued from IIT on to management and all of that, and were working venture capital, some of them, and their salary packages just completely ballooned. So there was a lot of difference. In fact, initially when we would used to occasionally go out with dinners with some of the folks, I would very clearly tell them that please don't go to a place I can't afford. Right? Let's be
Yeah.
clear. If I am going with you and you want me to come,
Yeah.
you have to factor this in. But you have to be, I think, perhaps a little unabashed about that decision. But maybe that decision you will be able to be unabashed once you've been validated before. And I mean that with all humility, and with whatever one I had, things that I had, because I had already gone into BCG, etc. People had already formed this impression ki acha theek hai, he's good, he can earn. They were perhaps willing to cut me a little bit more slack when I said ki I'm not earning that much, and not defining me by my pay packages. And now when I meet, I think as you grow older, I think you also start, like most people, my peers from this thing. But see, to be honest, I had some pressure, but not that much. I'll be very clear. Maybe others have more.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't want to discount, what others go through. But I have seen that as my colleagues have grown older, they have also started valuing other things in life, and they've started realizing what is the value of this. A lot of my friends, etc., have said that they want to create impact. They weren't enough money, and that is not really what drives them. So I think a little bit of that realization comes with age also. But money is always a factor everywhere. Families tend to ask you how much you make. They measure you by the kind of car you drive, by the house you live in. But that is also the reason why in YLAC, when we were looking at privilege, the fact that my grandparents or my parents built a house for me, and I did not have the pressure to raise or support old parents or family or siblings. That is a huge privilege that actually freed me in some way. If I had that pressure, perhaps I would not have been able to go down this route and take those cuts. Let's say I had a loan in BCG that needed to be paid back, I wouldn't have been able to do this. And that is also the reason why when you're looking at the term privilege, we also define it differently. One is just social, economic, but the second is also privilege manifests itself in different forms. In the context of gender, it is men, because you have an upper hand. So anybody who has privilege has also the ability to use that, because privilege will give you some agency, right? And how you use it will really matter.
That's what matters really. Let's step back to something that a lot of people find very exciting: taking a career break to rewire and do a degree. How was your experience at Harvard? How did the decision come out to be? And were you also considering any other degree when you went for an MPA?
I was initially planning for a master's, but I wasn't sure when or how. part of the reason I started looking more actively is because my co-founder and wife, at the time we were dating, and she was in Oxford studying her MPP, and she told me that I am thinking of doing a PhD. And I was telling her very vehemently, I don't think you should do a PhD. But she was insistent. So I said, okay, then let me also try.
Wow.
So that is how it initially started. But then, as I started looking, I wanted to study something in economics, and UK doesn't have that same ecosystem. And one thing led to another, and then I ended up finding this course at the Kennedy School. But I had always been looking, right after BCG also, I had already started looking at MBP courses. So it was already on my radar. But the trigger at that time was the fact that Aprajita said that she's not looking to come back right away and she's wanting to do a PhD. So I was like, enough of long distance. Let's figure out how some of this can happen. But I went to Harvard when Mr. Panda 2014, when we were going into elections. And sorry, I've forgotten the other part of your question.
No, how was your experience at Harvard?
Okay. Yeah, the experience at Harvard was fantastic. I think, firstly, I do think that mid-career thing is better than early in the career for a simple reason. I went after I had already led the policy team at Mr. Pandas. Going back to being a student, as you grow senior in your work life, it's not just about work. There's a lot of responsibility that comes on you. You are managing people. You are responsible for making sure everything is in place. Going back from there to being a student when you're only responsible for yourself, and even if you have a bad grade, your only response is very liberating. So I actually had a blast. And because I already had several years of work ex, and I went after 7 years of work ex, I already knew what I wanted out of the degree. So I didn't have as much FOMO as some of the other folks had. I was more clear. I was more self-assured, perhaps because of that. And because I was feeling liberated, I was able to maximize, use it in whatever way. So I attended different kinds of lectures, did courses that I was really interested in, met a lot of interesting people, made great friends. But I think my experience at Harvard, I did a lot of teaching at Harvard, and that really, I think, helped me become a better facilitator. And I think what also really stood out for me was the rigor. In IITs, in Indian colleges, you don't have that rigor. And the rigor in academics in some place like a Harvard is very intense. I remember in the first year we used to be given almost 3 assignments a week. And it was irritating because you hand in one, they'll give you another. I'm like, yeah, I need a break. I'm 30. Can't be doing this. But it was great learning. And something that really showed you that what it means to build quality in all that.
And how has it helped you since in the last 10 years of your career?
So I think the brand generally, again, signals quality. So I think that, of course, one. I wouldn't say that it has helped open too many domestic networks because of PRS and policy, I already am able to open those networks. So the value add there has been lesser, but this is not to say that combined together it's not a very potent combination. It is. So it has helped in that particular way. I think experiences there have helped in terms of, as I was saying, so I was in the second year, first semester, I was a CA, which is basically like somebody who was a student assistant. In the next semester, I was teaching. So I used to teach weekend to supplement what the faculty was teaching. And that's great learning. You actually learn a lot when you have to teach. So I think a lot of my economics understanding, some frameworks around policy ended up coming from that. So that's how it helped. And it also showed me how many different parts intersect. And one of the reasons I really wanted to go to the Kennedy School because I felt that I needed to understand economics better because that's a very core part of policy. And that really did help because my course was econ heavy, very econ heavy.
Yeah, that's great. But I think and I'm so glad that you got a full ride to your master's. But one of the things that a lot of people are concerned about are the student loans they incur in the process of doing their master's at a Harvard. I think for so many people in the social impact space, just the cost of it and knowing that there's no ROI after, they're trying to navigate that. Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, and this is a question that we also often get asked in the YLAC policy in action programs where a lot of young people are looking to sort of do some of this. My answer to them is that firstly, policy doesn't require necessarily a master's because policy is very intersectional. And I know of a lot of people who've grown really senior in policy, even some lamps and otherwise, who've not had a master's at all.
Yeah.
So it has not impacted their career growth at all. So that is number one. Number two is there are also options in India. So, and number three is that because policy doesn't necessarily require a master's, you should work a lot before you go, even if you go. And if you go after several years of work ex and you have a strong story of impact to tell, there is a high likelihood you will get a scholarship. The fact that I went 7 years after also helped, that the fact that I got a full scholarship, because I had a story to tell. I had a story to talk about my journey, what decisions I took, how I'm committed to this particular space. I had solid recommenders to back my work. None of that will happen if you do it too early in your career, because there's not enough evidence to say that. So I think usse bahut farak padta hai. And then when you're going, and if you are going on a loan, then you have to perhaps make your peace with the fact that for a couple of years you will have to work in spaces within the policy space that pay more than others before you sort of switch to what you're really passionate about.
Yeah, it's all about the choices you make
Yeah.
at the end of the day. Let's talk a little within TQH and YLAC. I think for you also, this was probably one of the first major experience of managing people,
Yeah.
and over the years, so many people. What has been that been like?
I think it's a
And
learning.
also, if I may add, at this point, I'm sure you are thinking of second rung leadership and all
Yeah.
of that. What have those things been like?
Yeah, we have always tried to build the organization like that. There is already a second, third rank. It's a tiered organization, very senior people. I think initially one of the other problems also happen is that when you're younger, there are not enough people who stay in the system for very long, right? So one of the things to build leadership also is that people have to stay with you for long and then grow in the organization.
Yeah.
So going forward also, I think from the very beginning, Aprajita and I were very clear that these both organizations cannot be person dependent organizations. That it cannot be, of course founders will obviously have an outsized role to play, but it cannot be that YLAC is equal to Aprajita Rohit, TQH is equal to Aprajita Rohit, and there are nobody else, so it cannot be a cult or like a personality driven thing. It has to have other people who front face things, who are the face of the organization, and who will be at the front. So we were very clear, and we were very clear that we wanted to design it in a system that there is a clear path, that we are promoting people, we are giving them leadership opportunities, we are making sure that they get front face time and they represent the organization. I think we've been doing that, and a lot of that run has started to happen. And I think management experience, yes, at Jayapanda's team, I was handling like 5, 7, 8 people. And with YLAC and TQH also, I think because we have been bootstrapped, and this is why it may be different from somewhere where an investor puts in a lot of money, it did not grow suddenly, right? So it has bootstrapped, it has grown organically. So we have grown from the first employee when we started working out of Defense Colony Social on the first floor, to 4 to 10 to 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, now 50. And so which has meant that it has allowed us a little bit of space to also learn and to build those systems. So I would like to think that we had always had the inclination that we want a very structured organization. I don't want decisions to be taken ad hoc on the basis of people and personalities, or who causes up with the founder, or whatever else. It's very clear, policies are laid out, structures are laid out, people know who are they reporting to, guidelines have been clearly made to say what is the culture, what do we want to sort of do, what are we not okay doing. And I think it's been a learning. And to be honest, the first challenge was when you have to delegate work completely. And with management, I think everybody goes through this.
Yeah.
Easiest to do work yourself, even though at that time you feel everybody is pounding
Yeah.
on you. Harder when you have to get work done from somebody.
Yes.
Harder still when you are level removed from the person who is starting to do work, because then you're going via.
Yeah.
And even when you go directly, you lose control. I think last year I was starting to feel that I'm finally starting to lose control, in the sense that I did not have visibility on everyone. When you're 35, 30 people, you can have visibility on everyone. But I think when you cross 35 or this thing, you start losing visibility. So I think then we started coming up with new systems. So I would see that it doesn't end, right? And I'm not sure we are perfect at it, but we are trying.
That's fantastic insight. I think we've talked a lot about successes. Let's talk a little about failures. What do you consider to be those one or two things that you regret or you learned from, even if it was a failure?
I think regrets, perhaps. I think my first biggest hit in terms of failure was UPSC, sort of not being able to, I mean, cracking it to some extent,
Yeah,
but not getting what I wanted to, and then decided it was a very hard decision because
yeah,
that made me question,
yeah,
whether I was cut out for it. And also the same thing about validation, that the fact that you've
mm,
not been able to clear this
yeah,
exam. In fact, even when I started working in policy after that for a while, you would always look to IS officers and think that, oh, maybe I'm missing out something.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it takes a while for you to make your peace with it, and
yeah,
also to be able to say boldly that, I didn't crack it, but that doesn't take away
yeah,
from
yeah,
anything I did or did not do.
yeah,
But that was also a learning. But I think learning there was about resilience and how many of these things in life are cyclical, right? You'll have your ups and downs. In fact, sometimes the president, I do think and worry that if everything is going smooth, there is going to be a downturn. It's just a matter
mm,
of time,
mm,
right? So I think, and to be honest, in the last year or so, last 2 years, there has been a little bit of that downturn on the YLAC side, not because we've been directly affected, but because the whole civic action
mm,
ecosystem has been affected,
mm,
right? So it's been about resilience, that, and I think that is really what defines entrepreneurs or people who do better than others, that you have to be able to push yourself through. This will happen, and there is no two ways
yeah,
around it. And
yeah,
I think, yeah, that's been
yeah,
no.
yeah. No, I think thank you. And I too have a lot of admiration for everyone and anyone who prepares for the civil service exam, at least seriously. There are people who
Yeah.
sometimes loiter around, which they have their own journey. It's a very disheartening sort of cycle and a lot of emotions involved. I think a lot of people have also, given the news cycle, been talking about the lateral hiring and the lateral entry,
Which was pulled, reverted back. Yeah.
yeah, but that's been happening in some ways or the other for a while. And given the kind of, if I may use the word, supply of policy professionals that we are seeing, the doors would be slammed harder, just in, like, let's say the people, because if we look at the policy space itself, it's 10-15 years has been a huge change in the space itself. Who knows what it would be like in the next 20 years? And I think a lot of people would, who, as you said, looked at the IAS officer and said, "Oh, I wish I had that kind of like job or that kind of work that an IAS officer is doing. Maybe we'll find that chance." What's your perspective on that?
On the lateral entry,
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, I do think that is the right thing to do.
Mm,
One of the increasingly things that, I mean, of course, you need generalists in the system, and I do have a lot of respect for IS officers in the sense that, because they've been at the district level and they've sort of grown in the ecosystem, they understand how the whole machinery works, what are the constraints at different levels, and they are able to bring in those perspectives. But, having said that, there is a huge amount of technical expertise that is needed.
mm,
And without it, what the government is doing, even when the government is not taking in people with lateral entry, the government is hiring consultants on short terms. And in fact, that has different kinds of implications. Firstly, you're not, and I think Yamini had written a piece on state capacity a while
yes,
earlier. It
in the
hollows
print.
out the state capacity internally. It can create potential conflicts of interest because the consultant may be working with somebody else
Yeah.
also outside. How do you make sure that the agenda is not
Yes.
driven in a bad way? In fact, we've had opportunities to work with government on some tech legislation. Somebody, I mean, we didn't get the opportunity, but there was a conversation. Would
Yeah.
you like to work on this? And we said, we work with private clients. I don't want a conflict,
Yeah.
right? So any of this can happen. So the question that happens is that ultimately, as things are getting more and more complicated, you need talent that understands that space. So
Mm,
shutting the system to that talent, I don't think is the right solution. We have to figure out other ways of making sure that all communities are represented. But I think there has to be a way for talent to kind of come in. And I think Western democracies the government benefits a lot from people,
mm,
moving in and out and, learning a lot from the this thing. And secondly, I think it is also simply from a young person's perspective, it is also very unfair that you have to decide your life's trajectory at so early in your life and then stick with that one thing. And if you do decide to leave, there is no way to come back. Right? So when you're trying to give UPSC, you're 24, 23, 30, whatever, and you're deciding for 60 when you have not seen the ecosystem from inside, you don't know what are the pulls and challenges, you don't know whether you're comfortable, and going in that this is going to be my life for my life, right? The whole life. I think it's too much of an expectation, and I think loosening up a little bit will help a lot. I personally don't agree with the decision of reversal, and but I can understand the politics around it.
And I think one of the things which has, like, I'm just so grateful. LAMP started 14 years back. I'm grateful for all the LAMPs and CMGJs, CM fellowships, and now there's Indian Administrative Fellowship, which is bringing even more senior people into the system, and all the Niti Aayog hirings and all of that. That has gone crazy. And I also believe that 15 years down the line, when someone who has worked with IS officers on the ground as a CM fellow or PMRDF, that person would also have had seen the kind of working of governance at a district level. When that person has to work at ministry. But also, I think especially the last few years has seen a proliferation of fellowships, and some of them sometimes are not that good. A lot of people are finding it challenging to figure out which are the fellowships they should go for and which are not. What's your advice on that?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different fellowships that have come in, and to be honest, my advice to even fellows in YLAC when they're sort of thinking about some of these things is that you need to first know what is it that you really want to learn. And is this just an experimentation you're trying to do where you're dipping your feet into the water to gauge its temperature and understand you're comfortable with this space, or is it something that you're doing as a stepping stone to a career? You have to pick the fellowships based on that. So what is it? Are you wanting to work on implementation? Are you wanting to work on policy design? If you're wanting to work on implementation, LAMP is not necessarily the best place for you. CMGGA may be a better place for you.
I did both, so I got a sense of both.
And they're very different, right? And they're very different in terms of exposure. Then the second also is that I think a lot of people ask which ones should we apply for, and I do tell them that all fellowships are not well managed. It also depends a lot on the person you're placed with, whether they want to use you. So you have to, one, do your due diligence, speak to people, do your research, find out past experiences before you take a decision. But also be agile and flexible when you go. I think people lose out a lot if they're very rigid. And this goes to the same point of internships in MP offices. An opportunity will be what you make of it also, right? Let's say you are placed in a district and the collector is not making the best use of you. Can you be enterprising and use that time for something else? So I think, to be honest, 1 year in a young person's life, if they don't have any very pressing financial commitments, is not that big a deal. So I think if you can, there is definitely merit in taking one or so, but you should do your diligence before you go, because everything is not.
I would recommend to those people, just go and do YLAC course, get a sense, and then make a probably wiser, more invested, high-touch choice. Another thing, I think we have been talking about this lovely person who's your life partner and your partner in the business. I have frankly known her more than I have known you, and she's always come across as this warm person who is so intelligent and so smart about so many different things, and that speaks the kind of work that you have been doing, the breadth of the work speaks for your abilities as two individuals who were able to pull this off. But what, like, you initially in our conversation also mentioned that there were people who cautioned against starting something with your partner, but what has been the journey like?
It's been fantastic. And I mean, I basically, Prajna and I got together, started dating when a year after, I think, when her LAMP ended, our conversation started with our love for politics. And the fact that at one point both of us were very keen on getting into politics. That's a very different sort of conversation, and that's how it started. And we would have very long conversations on how to kind of do that. So I think there are lots of similarities and dissimilarities in us. We are very passionate about, I think, similar things. We have same tastes in many different things, but we are also dissimilar in terms of somewhat personalities, which we discovered later. So I am somebody who goes more in depth. She's somebody who goes wider. And I think that is very useful when you're looking at a founder, because you need to do both. I think so. When we were looking to start out, I don't even remember how this conversation started, that we can start something together. But before going into Harvard, I think I had already decided that we'll start something by the time I come back, or at least after my first year. So I was never really looking for jobs or anything like that. And as I mentioned in the lab, my friend and classmate came and told me that, oh my God, why are you doing this? Her concern was coming from the fact, and rightly so, that when you're working with your spouse, you know too much about the other person. Right? So that, and the fact that friction at office will come to friction at home, and unless you have the maturity to be able to handle it, both can fall apart together.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not just that your personal life will fall apart, your work will also fall apart. And I have seen in a very close friend who had a similar setup, running a social impact sector organization, see this happen. And it can be very traumatizing. And so either you have to have really the maturity and the resilience to be able to deal with this kind of a stuff, or it won't work. So that was where the reservation was coming from. Front forward, or fast forward several years later, I also see, interestingly, I have found this trend that in the social sector, a lot of organizations are run by couples.
Yeah.
So it is surprising.
Yeah.
It's almost like this कि एक जुनूनी को दूसरा जुनूनी चाहिए थोड़ा पागलपन मचाने के लिए. And maybe it has got to do with the fact that you need somebody who understands why you care.
Yeah.
To sort of do this and understand those unique challenges that come with this particular space. So I think that is there. But in terms of how the experience has been, I think that what really does help is that there is a lot of trust, right? And there is things don't fall through the cracks in terms of miscommunication, because we are having strategy discussions at 12 in the midnight while taking a walk, right? So anything that happens, I get to know, she gets to know. So, there's no usually when you have two founders who are not together, some people are reporting to some, everything, there won't be as much information flow as it happens when you're a couple, because, obviously you live together. So there's a lot of information flow. So there's a lot of trust. So that is there. But obviously there are also challenges for which you need maturity. There could be power tussles. For us, our biggest fights or, issues are around HR. And, it started initially when, we had shared resources, like people would be staffed on projects for me and Aprajita both, right? And I would call her up and say that I have a deadline. You have given this person this work. How is he supposed to do my work now? And then dhire dhire we figured out how to manage it. But basically, most of our conversations or disagreements are around work stuff and less on the personal stuff. And, if somebody were to look at our fights, they would be very amused.
I think kudos to you. I've not had the experience of working with a partner on something, but even collaborating with friends, it's always so tricky.
And then, I think my biggest learning in life had also been that when I was at Jay Panda's office, there were two people who used to report to me, both one LAM fellow at that time and one was an ex-LAM fellow. And they became very good friends. And they're some of my best friends now. And, we were reflecting once on it. After that, I have always advised people that you should not become too good friends with somebody you're managing at a workplace unless you're sure of their work ethic. Because that is really what causes friction. So you have to have very similar work ethics to be able to and respect for each other to be able to handle disagreements and work with them. So among friends, let's say two people are working on something, if there is a disproportionate burden that somebody is bearing, it will definitely lead to friction. I think what happens in Aprajita's and my context is that occasionally there are moments of disproportionate burden on one or the other, but we step in and do that. And we also are very open to talking about issues that, I am feeling ki mere pe load zyada aaya hua hai. Can you step in? Or stuff like that. So I think that is very, very important.
That makes sense. And I think one of the words that I picked on, there was also this image of she posting about you on her birthday because you were having the FOMO of like not being on Instagram. But one of the words that I was picking up from what you were saying was the word trust. And I think one of the things I've heard across the board from people working at YLAC and TQH is the kind of trust that Rohit and Aprajita have been placing in us and our work. And I think, again, that's delightful to hear, because in the world where there's so many toxic workplaces and for various
Yeah,
reasons,
no, of course.
it's you have built a beautiful place.
I mean, and that's what we are trying. I'm just hoping that as it grows, and I was saying that you have a fleeting sense of losing control, that it doesn't go away, and that is why, as we are learning and experimenting, the hope is really that it gets imbibed in the culture so much that it doesn't matter what we say after a point. But I do feel that if there is trust in the ecosystem, there's a multiplier effect of that trust, because in fact in economics that I was taught in Harvard, the importance of trust in economic development. When there is a lot more trust in the ecosystem, friction in transactions reduces because you're doing less number of checks. For instance, Amazon delivery guy will leave a packet outside your house without worrying that it will not be delivered to you. And when there's more trust in the ecosystem, the whole ecosystem starts performing better and faster. And that is true for organizations as well. Because if you don't have trust, I'm going to build in checks everywhere. I'm going to slow you down, right? So, and I think that is also something that is really important.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about the past and what you've been doing and your experiences. What do you think future holds for you? What's the vision for the next 10 years or 5 years?
I'm not a very firm believer in having very long-ended visions, because based on my own experience, I mean, you can only foresee so much. Planning for one thing and something else completely happens because there's so much that you can't control. But in terms of vision for both organizations, the goal has been that you're trying to push public policy or social development, both from the top down and the bottom up. For TQH, which does more the top down work, the idea is that you're able to strengthen voices that inform policy. So right now, a lot of our work is in tech, gender, some other parts of social policy. We really are hoping and we're looking to build it in multiple verticals and create strong champions within the organization, so that, and then push the needle, actually see policy change happen because of what we've been doing. In fact, we've already started to do something, because now when we reach out to clients, people ask that, you've been around for a while, have you been able to make some changes? And we have those case studies. I know for a fact that this happened because of the string of things that we pulled. So I'm really hoping that some good laws changes happen, because we were able to sort of shape that narrative, and we do it across the board, and we build this capacity for evidence-based research across sectors. In YLAC, to be honest, it's just hard to define what it kind of means. But we were recently applying for sort of an incubator, and they were using this term social unicorn, which is basically that how do you unlock $1 billion worth of value for society? With YLAC, the goal is to do it through active citizens. In the long term, I would ideally want some of these conversations, the way we raise our kids in India is so siloed कि पहले से ही साइंस में बकेट कर दोगे या ह्यूमैनिटीज में बकेट कर दोगे. You don't open people's minds, make them question their privilege. My long-term goal is that can we sort of create some ecosystems changes that this percolates down, and the agent of change will be like what PRS LAM fellowship is, right? So I'm really hoping that in the next 10 years, as we've crossed the gestation period of people growing older, our high school guys becoming influential, our policy fellows becoming influential, that across sectors we have these people who really started to exert their influence. And so let's see what happens.
More power to that thought. You'll always have an admirer in me for the work you're doing. I think now we come to my favorite part of the conversation, which is the rapid fire. Most of the questions in this rapid
fire... Is it
fire...
going to be like a Karan Johar rapid fire?
But it's not going to be that much fire. You don't have to be that much quick. Don't worry, you can take your time. I think, and most of the questions are unscripted. They have actually been informed by the conversation we have had until now. So, let's
okay,
see.
Cool. Let's see how I fare. I hope this is not where I don't walk out of this requiring external validation. I failed in this rapid fire round.
Let's see. But I think my first question is, you've mentioned Sushma Swaraj in our conversation. You mentioned her so many times at different forums, and we share her admiration.
Yeah.
She actually also comes from very close to where you grew up, and same
Yeah.
for me as well. If you wanted to speak with her and get her advice or listen to a story from her, what would it be?
I think I really want to understand how she does her oratory, and what is it that, because to be honest, I don't have that kind of charm or that
Yeah,
ability to hold an audience. I
yeah,
would really want tips and tricks on how to
yeah.
do
And
that.
she learned Kannada in a week in 1908,
And
99
and
just to be and give such good
and the
speeches.
command, to be honest, I'm not good at languages, and I'm
Yeah.
going to be very honest. Badi mushkil se I managed to learn one or two. So I'm just sticking with that. The command over Hindi, for instance, and I
Yeah,
always used to feel that the way she would speak, this gravitas that would come through,
yeah,
and this hitting the punch at the right point.
yeah,
I'm not able to do it, so I would really want to
yeah.
know that.
The most admirable quality of Aparajita's.
I think she's very vibrant, and she really does care. She has a lot of friends, and I think she's somebody who people really count on, and she really does care for you. Matlab, I think the admirable quality is that her relationships are not transactional at all,
Hmm.
and for somebody to have this, being able to build this huge network of friends, family, and to care about each one, and then also being holding everything else together. I think that's really, and she's very a lot of fun, very vibrant. I think more than I am.
I'm a hardcore romantic, so just so glad that you guys have such wonderful relationship. An alternate career choice for you.
I wanted to be a scientist when I was growing up. Initially, years of IIT also, I had taken this project on wind tunnels. We were figuring out कि airplanes कैसे बनेंगे, NASA कैसे जाएंगे हम. That would have been this thing. Now, in hindsight, I'm thinking I may have really enjoyed architecture as well, because I do enjoy design and stuff like that, and I do feel that there is a certain attention of detail required there, which I have an appreciation for.
Hmm. Only because you mentioned that Karan Johar made that Karan Johar comment, this question is just coming from that. The favorite person you've worked with or managed at TQH and YLAC until now, and why?
Oh, that's a tricky one. There are some people currently employed. I won't want to go there. No, I won't want to go there. But no, there have been like several, and everybody. There have been people have had like different kinds of.
Okay, let's twist the question. And what do you actually admire, given that you have managed so many people? What's one thing that distinguishes people for you, and just generally you want to
Yeah,
advise people should have?
I think for me, attitude matters a lot more than skill.
Hmm.
I think skill I can still teach you, but I do really like people who have a good attitude, that let's want to get things done, are willing to work hard, and yeah, and also humility.
Hmm. On a scale of 1 to 10, if you were to rate yourself as a manager or a boss.
As a manager or a boss, to be honest, people do upward feedbacks, but I'm not sure how accurate they are being if I were to use that. I mean, I think I can be somewhat anal about certain things, but I would think I'm a reasonably accommodative and approachable boss. I would perhaps, I don't know, you'll have to check with me, perhaps rate myself at 8.
That's a good score. Your most exciting project until now, and why?
I mean, on the YLAC side, I've really, equality clubs has been something that I really felt very passionately about, and that was the one that we started with Oxfam. And the idea was to take the conversations on inequality and privilege to schools and talk about things like gender, economic, caste, disability in ways that sensitizes young people. And I at that time we were a smaller team. We designed the curriculum in house, and I then saw some of the conversations that panned out after that. On why, like, that's my sort of favorite project. In TQH, there are many actually in TQH, and I've loved working on competition. Though we don't take too many external positions on that, I do find that very, very exciting. But increasingly, I have a newer project, which, thanks to my friend Nipun, that has really been something that I'm very passionate about. I think accessibility. is something that we've started work on, and Nipun is somebody who became a close friend, and I got sensitized to the reality of how inaccessible spaces are as able-bodied people. I think sometimes we don't kind of realize it, and I think working with him on trying to amp up the advocacy on that has been it's very something that we care about. I care about a lot, and so that's been very exciting.
Yeah, I've been following your work on that, and it's been actually very
heartening. And I'm really hoping to build a more structured setup. So we've been pitching for a lot of different funding, etc., to try and amp it up. So let's see what happens.
A book that has left a mark on you.
A book that has left
a book, or a speech, a podcast, anything.
India's struggle for independence is what I studied for the IS prep. Bipin Chandrawali. But it really, for somebody who did not have, I didn't used to love history or any of that at that time. So that is one. There are many others. I actually read a lot of historical fiction. So
I would take notes from you after.
So I read it, and I also read rom-coms. So I'm not sure if I should name a favorite rom-com.
Now I want to know.
One of the other books that I really loved is The Invention of Wings. Is something that I read, which was actually, there are 2 or 3. Initially I was blanking out. So Invention of Wings, which I read, which is basically, it is between a white girl in the US and a slave who's given to her when she's a kid. And they grow up together, and each chapter, turn by turn, is the story narrated from the slave side and the story narrated from the master side. And in the end, how they become friends, and how then the white person tries and liberates her. And it is actually situated in the slavery's context, but fictionalized for the storytelling piece. That is something I like. There's a book called Great Decision, which talks about the US Supreme Court, the rise of that. That is fantastic. And there are a bunch of rom-coms.
I would recommend, if you like historical fiction, Alex Rutherford's Mughals, Empire of the Mughals.
Oh, it's okay.
It covers all the major, from Babur to Aurangzeb, all the major Mughal rulers. It's a very good one.
Try and pick it up.
Yes. There are a lot of policy influencers now. What's your opinion on that?
I don't know. Influencers, what's the definition of influencer? There are activists who I think are doing the right job.
I would say people who are creating content around public policy, and especially careers in public policy and social impact.
Okay. See, I think there is need to break down. I'm not good at it, so I'm not able to sort of speak to that. But I think there is a need to sort of make things more accessible. But I think in that, we should just make sure that we don't lose our depth. Otherwise, I think, to be honest, each influencer kind of serves their own market and their own this thing. So I really think there is a value to each one of them. But I do sometimes feel that, sometimes I feel that there is a difference between the online personality of a person and the in-person personality. I think that disconnect is a little disparaging, but yeah.
And a person in the sector who has left a big mark on you, or someone you look up to as a role model.
Yeah, there are actually a lot in many different ways, and I really do look up to. Of course, there are a lot of people who are working in policy on consulting side, and all of that. But I really do look up to. I have a lot of respect for civil society, and I do feel that civil society is the moral compass of, in many different ways, pushes everybody to sometimes do better. So I think I do have a lot of, without specifically naming anyone, because there are many people, is that when people really push for things against all odds and get things done, that's something I really do have a lot of admiration for. And I've seen that people were doing that on the social justice side, doing it on the educational front, doing it on the internet freedom front. And there are a lot of voices who really, sometimes I really admire how much gumption they have to sort of just hold their own and also to speak their mind.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
It has been fantastic speaking with you, Rohit. Any parting thoughts that you have for us, or any advice you would like to give to people already in the sector and people who are considering coming in the sector?
I think first, parting thoughts. If I messed up anywhere, you can cut that part in the podcast. But advice for people, I mean, I do feel sometimes that I think being genuine in, really caring about some of the things you do, so that work is not, I mean, for me, policy is not just work. You really do care about certain things. And I think that somehow makes you a little bit more effective. I think that would be one thing that, don't let your passion or see, as you grow older, you start with a lot of idealism, and it's historically recorded, well observed pattern. Realism starts creeping in as you grow older. I think you should try and to retain some of that, even that you color your idealism with a little bit with realism. Don't let that energy die down and be young and passionate. I think that is really important. Even as you age, that should be something that you really care about, that sort of helps you get up and go to work and say that I want to do this. Because policy is slow moving, and it can be extremely frustrating. And if you don't have something that gives you a lot of excitement, or you feel passionate about, you care about, it may start losing its charm. And you start also seeing people for who they are, and the power brokering that happens, right? So I think that would be my one advice, that retain that passion and retain that a little bit of idealism, a little bit of hope, to keep doing what you're wanting to do.
That's really wonderful thought, and some really good food for thought. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Ayush. Thank you for having me.